I heard you like proxy wars.
Boy, do I!
What about conspiratorial secret societies doing them?
Boy, do I!
Magnificent. I shall introduce you to my dealer. Ask for Era of Atlantis.
Boy, do I!
Are you just going to keep saying, boy, do I?
Boy, do I! How to play. In Era of Atlantis, you're trying to get more victory points than everyone else. Here's the twist. Unlike other area control games where you control one faction, here everyone instead plays as a secret society puppeteering the world's major nations. In fact, each player controls 2 major nations, and each major nation will have 2 players controlling it, so hilarious conflicts of interest are abound. All nations, both major and minor, have a power value, and the major nations have a power track over here. As major nations take control of minor nations, their power will be added to the major nations track. Higher power not only makes your nation's actions stronger, but also is what determines how many points players who control the major nation get at game end. However, the final score from your major nations only counts the lower of your 2, so no fully dedicating to one of your major nations and leaving the other hanging. That's the main way to get points, but there's a few other ways to squeeze out more. If you control the major nation with the most power at game end, that's 2 bonus points. There's game and objective cards that reward points. Finally, the game's general resource/currency is called Virya, and while it can be spent as a cost for stronger actions, it also gives bonus points if you kept any when the game ends. As for game structure, at the end of a round, aka everyone has gone once clockwise, you check for game end, which are when any of these 3 conditions are met. The round counter meets the natural game end tracker, the round counter meets the doom tracker, which progresses for destroying things, and lastly, if 7 of these white buildings are constructed. FYI, each of these endings correspond to the 3 different types of objective cards. At the start of the game, we will randomly pick first player before picking our secret societies, dealing out random objective cards, and then snake drafting the major nations. On your turn, you only pick 1 action from 9 possible options. Most of them correspond to your major nations, while the others are your secret societies. With one of your 2 action pawns, you move it on the action you want and simply perform it. These pawns block the space, making it unavailable until it's moved off to do another action. It can't do the same action 2 turns in a row. Explaining major nation actions, the first is Gather Virya. This action makes both you and the other player who controls this major nation gain Virya equal to that nation's total power. Next is Construct, where you can place any building onto a building slot that nation controls. You can place more than 1, but each building beyond the first will cost an additional 5 Virya each. Building options range from developing the area's military to economical benefits and even increasing the power value. Recruit has you place military units in each area that major nation controls equal to the power level of that area. You can also spawn additional units at a cost of 1 Virya per dude. Movement allows each unit to move to an adjacent space, thus you're allowed to split them off into groups however you please. But there's some nuances. First and foremost, check if any of these movements cause a conflict, which means there's opposition there. Your movements may not cause more than 1 conflict unless you pay 5 Virya per additional conflict. Also, crossing water is a thing, so these 2 nations are connected, but to cross water, note the cost on the board. You gotta kill that many units per group crossing. Also, you're never allowed to move units into other major nations. So if you want to attack a major nation's homeland, here's a global conflict, where you must pay 7 Virya to target a major nation and do a conflict involving all of your units versus all of theirs, regardless of location, with potential for massive rewards and damages. Lastly, major nations can do special actions, which you can only unlock if that major nation took control of a minor nation with this type of tile shape, opening a new space to place the action pawn for that major nation. These effects are powerful and unique, with their effects depicted here. Because they're attached to minor nations, their control can shift on a dime as opposing major nations fight over powerful effects. For the final 3 secret society actions, you place the action pawn on your own board. This one is Intrigue, allowing you to airdrop your secret society's agents wherever on the board, paying 1 Virya per agent regardless of its value. Unless it's 0, those are free. Also, you can additionally swap around your existing agent's positioning for free. These agents let you do conflict on a different axis, utilizing political might instead of military. Speaking of, this action is Coup, which lets you pick an opposing spot that has your agents and cause a political battle there instead of military. Explaining how fights work, you add up the values of the 2 sides to compare. In the case of a coup, this bonus would be the agents. The defenders also get a bonus from their place's defense value, which politically is the purple flag. With the totals in mind, involved players can now secretly bid Viria to increase their side's value, with higher Viria costs bringing diminishing returns. This is where determining who's involved gets interesting because of all the shared major nations. First, if you're the turn player causing a conflict, you're always the attacker, while everyone else there has varying options depending on this flowchart. But for the sake of simplicity, if you belong to one side, you can only bid for that side, and if you're neither side or both, you may bid for either one. So in the case of this example coup, the turn player pink is attacking this minor nation controlled by these two players, orange and purple, who are the defenders from owning the blue major nation. This is the total of pink's agents on offense. This is the total of the defense, which is the area's flag number, and orange's agents because the purple player doesn't have any agents here. Finally, the white player has an agent here, and since they aren't attacker plus don't control the defending nation, a white gets to choose who to support with their agent plus bid or even sit out entirely. This is because the bid dial has options to be on offense, non-combatant, or defense. Of course, if you're the attacker or defender, you must bid on the appropriate side. Unless white announces their intentions, neither side will know how white will swing the numbers, if at all, until all the bids are revealed and the final attacker-defender values are totaled, with defender winning ties. In the case of military conflict, the bidding works exactly the same as a coup, except you're comparing the values of the military units, and the defender uses this brown shield number as a bonus. For military conflicts, reminder that these guys don't add their numbers to military strength, so the only thing they do is affect participation. Because while those who actually own the nations are always involved, someone with agents in a location can choose to be involved via bidding. As for the results of conflicts and coups, for minor nations, a success will end up taking control of the spot and killing all of the opposing military units. The main differences are that coups will remove all agents that were involved, and conflicts will destroy one building and remove one agent. For major nations, while you can't move in for military conflict, you are allowed to coup them. Works the same, defenders use the purple flag, but winning that results in swapping one of your control cubes with one of its owners. Difficult and the only way to change around who controls what major nations. If you want to use military though, you gotta do a global conflict, which counts up the total military unit count of the attacking nation versus the defending nation across the board, and the defender bonus uses the homeland brown shield value. With those values determined, you do bidding that allows all players at the table to be involved, and the defeated major nation must lose 2 buildings and or minor nations plus half of all their military units. Furthermore, if the global conflict was an underdog victory power-wise, not militarily, that lesser power nation gets a permanent power boost. The last action is repolarize, where you pay Viria equal to the round count and can swap out the objective cards you were dealt with the face-up public ones on this sideboard that further modifies the objectives. For instance, whatever objective in this slot ends up earning you 2 extra Viria at game end just for having it. Cards in this slot are worth 1 more point each if that ending is achieved. And the last one just gives you 6 Viria if you take it when doing repolarize. Finally, to explain those objectives, each card is worth this many points if the game ends in this way. So, as an example, if the game ended via the 7 white buildings way and 3 people had this type of card, each of them would get 1 point per card. Doesn't matter how many copies of Ascension those 3 had, this is only checking how many players had any. Now then, before we go into the pros and cons, quick disclaimer that this is a paid sponsored review. Thanks to CJ Games for supporting us. I'm giving my honest take, but this being a sponsored video and all means subconscious biases, so if you feel that that compromises the analysis, that's super valid. But I do hope you give it a chance, because that's all I could ever ask for. Played 5 sessions, all at either 4 or 5 player, using all of the rules, aka the advanced variant, which adds further asymmetry to the secret societies and major nations. But do note that there is an introductory version which cuts out a lot of the endgame scoring complexity, alongside variants for 2 and 3 players that we didn't play. And a reminder that this is a prototype, so stuff is subject to change, especially the components, because meanwhile from a gameplay standpoint, this honestly feels super fleshed out. Starting with the component pros. I'm gonna first focus on the overall readability of Era of Atlantis, since there's a ton of info presented everywhere on the board. I'd say what's done the best are the elements revolving around players standing within the game. Ergo, the power track and the round track displaying how strong you are and how/when the game's ending. Huge props to the power tracker being a thing because, oh my god, would this game be unbearable to play if evaluating all of the major nations wasn't something that could be done at a glance given how entangled everyone's game states are. Also, nice that the token is hollow to see the exact amount instead of covering it with a token/cube. Which, speaking of, the bonus power token is like that, which is fine since it's for a bonus you can get from a specific type of building that only scores when the game ends. So overall, this whole power tracker area works great at keeping gameplay smooth. Ideally, this whole board is dual layered with insets for all the buildings and power trackers for that tactile satisfaction and prevention of pieces shifting their spot, because that's a very real thing when it comes to lengthier tracks. But this ain't no massive blockbuster triple-A board game. As for the round tracker, it's got decently sized dividers for the pieces on it, meaning better visibility and representation of its importance. Very visible, very distinct game end pieces and round marker pieces here as they inch towards each other. And of course, the other way the game ends, with at least 7 out of these 9 white tempos being up at round end, and it's placed right by the round track. No complaints there. In fact, see these white cubes on the track? Let's use them as a springboard to talk mnemonics, cause Era of Atlantis does a great job with making you do certain actions and movements of pieces to better entrench them in your memory so we can fast forward more of the abstraction and get into the gameplay. At least for a lot of the key actions, core gameplay stuff. The hell am I talking about? In the case of tangibility with those white cubes, if any of those 3 track elements reaches a cube, it gets moved over to where the white tempos are, where you may notice icons for 2 cubes per upper 4 buildings. All that means is that every 2 cubes that go here unlocks a building, so players can't just bum rush this game end condition without some effort, because those white cubes can come from not just a round track but also certain spots on the map, which by the way work as expected too, in that if a military unit moves into said spot, the cube moves over. And stuff like how the act of having to move this action pawn around to do anything is very tangible, especially since you only do 1 action on your turn. Granted, a lot can happen on a turn, so I'm specifically talking less about mechanics nuances and more that when it comes to the broad strokes of understanding your actions, it's easier to assess and pick up how they work, not so much the application of the hard to discern moves. Generally a pretty good formula for making replayable games, with a lot of depth at double duties by also providing newcomers with easier onboarding. Building little memory habits just by playing the game when combined with Era of Atlantis' iconography everywhere also means that forgetting about things gets a little harder too, because even if you're only somewhat familiar with everything, getting a hint just by looking at icons is a great reminder. Now, I wouldn't call any of the icons immediately intuitive. It's definitely more of a thing that acts to jog your memory once you already know the ruling. They're more so further mnemonic features that combine well with the aforementioned tangibility. Like one example being the game end timer has icons on it reminding you to flip it if any of these things occur. And what that means is instead of progressing on the track at the end of the round, just like the natural round tracker, it instead stays put and flips, something that gets entrenched in memory easily as part of the end of the round upkeep. But perhaps the best showcase of this way of using iconography in action comes from the special action tiles, which have the text effect on one side and the icons on the other. Could have easily been something that either wasted space by not having anything useful on the other side, or gone the other direction by trying to save space by making the different sides just have different special actions, which would make it way more annoying digging through looking for the one you need. Next, it's nice how everyone gets a bidding dial with a different colored backside to make it even more obviously apparent which player is doing what. Way more preferable than when games only provide a limited amount of dials with shared visuals. Though in this case, it's a nicely distinct necessity due to how it's technically possible for all 5 players at a table to be involved in the same conflict even if there aren't all 5 nations participating. Finally, the player aids are really comprehensive. Not only are there enough for everyone, thank God, because I'm always baffled when other games don't do that, but these aids also work great when it comes to hitting a nice balance of encompassing info without being too overwhelming. Emphasis on two, because obviously this is a lot of text for a player aid. That works a lot better though when there's also plenty of empty space and dividing colors and sections so that everything is really clear to look at. Of course, it's probably impossible to be comprehensive without some degree of having people's eyes glaze over, but this is as good as it gets because all the simplified basics are there without the full rules nuances for all the actions, buildings, and win cons. Anecdotally, had people occasionally go like, wait, where does it say that special ability here? And I'd have to be like, ain't no way it's not there, and then we look at it again before they go like, maybe. I am Mo, this is a significantly less annoying alternative than when people are like, where does it say the thing? And the thing isn't even in the player aid in the first place. And what also makes having so many words so much more okay say in my book in this case is how they're well organized alongside having icons and bold text used everywhere. Plus, this wordy part is only for the actions, which makes sense since that's like most of what you're doing in the game. While the reverse side is all icons, which gives more player aid vibes at the cost of explanation. But that's totally fine since this stuff isn't as core as your turn-to-turn actions. And you probably only look at this once or twice to remind yourself about the game's objectives, since the buildings part most of the time just ends up being a nice-to-have redundancy because of how they're mostly explained in the action side. This also means this player aid dodges the pitfall of having to constantly be flipped over because of something like the actions being split between two sides, which slows down action rumination. So yeah, thank God for the actions being on one side and other info being on the back, so there's distinctly different usage points during gameplay. Overall, the components of the prototype are pretty good in their usage and visuals. Obviously, there's some tactile feel that's definitely going to be better come final release because production quality material is going to be better than janky assembling. But the fundamentals are nailed down, which is already pretty impressive for a prototype. Any improvements that could happen besides deluxifying the components, so like usage improvements, not cosmetic stuff like minis and nicer tokens, would all be minor benefits. Definitely would still be welcome, but point is, Era of Atlantis is absolutely not in a concerning state in the component department. Can't talk about the insert and organization, unfortunately, because that's a really big deal, but given that this isn't going to be like a 30-pound campaign board game, I doubt it can be messed up that badly, so I'm not super concerned on that end. So, let's talk about the far more important substance that should be focused on in a prototype. Gameplay pros. The biggest thing I want to highlight is just how weird and fresh this game is. Like, there is so much variety in the game states and a bajillion options that can branch out of it. Era of Atlantis achieves this because of 1, the random setup, 2, the gajillion ways to improve your point standing, and 3, how interconnected all the different systems are. You put all that together and the possibility space becomes absurd since there gets to be so many ways to frame the game state and justify why any given action should be done. Very important in an area control game because you gotta play the table, not just play the game. Especially since, reminder, that everyone shares control of the major nations with someone else. This is easily one of, if not the most unique area control I've ever played, providing incredibly tangled alliance shit shows and absurd circumstances guaranteed. Unique, however, doesn't necessarily mean good. I can melt chocolate over mashed potatoes, call it the most unique mash and gravy ever. God knows what that tastes like. Era of Atlantis, though, is some fusion food that mixes well, and I'm gonna explain why I think so. First off, the random setup actually makes a huge deal for opening plays and how that reverberates throughout the course of the game. All the minor nations get randomized stats, and more importantly, special tile actions will be randomly drawn and placed. And given that these are usually extremely strong actions to own, they're gonna be fought over. And there's a lot of variety there, because you draw 4 from 14, so that's a lot of permutations of possible special actions on top of the different gameplay you get simply because of where they end up being placed. Furthermore, the starting stats for the major nations greatly influence who's gonna be vulnerable to which types of attacks, notably global conflicts and coups. Those two, when performed on a major nation, provide probably the swingiest outcomes in the game, making them extremely important to keep track of at all times. And if you ever see a major nation vulnerable to one of these, you absolutely should jump on the opportunity. Reminder that winning a coup against a major nation allows you to swap control of one of your major nations with your coup target. So you can feasibly go from last to first place with this. Meanwhile, global conflict lets you kill half of that major nation's military, 2 of their buildings or minor nation ownerships, and if you are a power underdog, your major nation that initiated the global conflict gets a loot token of your choice, with values ranging from 2 to 4, so whoever first dibs the 4 likely has cemented their major nation's standing as a top contender for the rest of the game. Since unlike power from controlling territory and buildings that can be lost from attacks and whatnot, that +4 is never going away, making it extremely hard to actually lower their power drastically. Thus, the random starting setup values for major nations paint very notable targets against the nations that have a 0 in a stat, and becomes an extremely pivotal aspect to play around. Do you invest into shoring up defenses by constructing a bunch, thus losing out on the option to get more utility from other buildings? Or maybe you just build normally and then just keep a bunch of actual units/agents around, limiting your ability to expand. Maybe the game state is such that you decide to neglect your nation vulnerable to global conflict, knowing that it's too vulnerable trouble and annoying to manage. So you invest entirely into your other major nation, and then plan to coup the major nation that got a 0 in its political stability stat so you can swap ownership. The amount of ways to frame your strategies and maneuver around the gameplay is so multifaceted, and that's all just from a mechanical standpoint, because remember, you can also just play the table and get people to not attack you that way, like threaten to coup them the instant they global conflict. But as you've probably seen from that example, the different ways you have to inch forward and claw to get more points are so varied, linked, and subsequently thoughtful. Most of the time, one turn can only get you a power or two, and given the limited real estate and how you gotta up the power for 2 nations, it almost feels zero-sum as spots run out and the points buildings all get built and component limited. Like you build too many pyramids and that blocks others from also doing so if there's no more left. On top of all that, everything you do is helping someone else because every major nation has 2 owners. And what all that ultimately results in is having to do some brain burning to figure out how to actually pull ahead of others in points because it's never straightforward. Like, look at everything that gives you score. Major nation power? They're all co-owned. Virya? You'd think that this would be a selfish source of points, but then think about how you actually obtain this. Significant sources are commonly obtained through the collect Virya action and Temples of Darkness. And since those are both tied to major nations, they always benefit 2 people. FYI, Darkness Temples get 3 for the players that own the major nation the temple is in whenever Doom progresses, which happens whenever a building is destroyed, so just attack places with buildings, easy peasy. Also, Doom Tracker meeting Round Tracker is one of the victory conditions, so this isn't out of the way to do. Objective cards can maybe only help you, but I've never seen this happen, cause usually when the game ends, 2 or 3 people held that kind of objective. Reminder, there's only 3 types, and everyone holds 2, while also being able to adjust which ones they're holding during gameplay. Lastly, controlling the most powerful nation gets 2 bonus points, so yeah, 2 people are getting that. As a result, finding ways to actually come ahead by even a single point over others matters like a lot. So if you can get the most out of tiny point sources like objectives compared to everyone else, that can very well eke out a win for you. This is a game where it's not uncommon to see something like first place wins with 20 points, second with 19, third with 18 type shit. And then I usually saw last place down at like 12 or something, because it's pretty easy for last place to be the one caught holding the bag when the dust settles in the last few rounds. Usually last turns involve mad land grabs, major nation coups, massively swingy actions players plan out to go try and be an incontestable victor. Absolutely horrifying to own the strongest major nation and then have it swap with the weakest on the last turn. God, the victory point maneuverability in this game is insane and makes it feel like you're never safe, but also never out of the game. TLDR, you can do so many things to get points, but you also gotta figure out which paths help others the least. It's giving like Rising Sun alliances with all the malicious compliance, and I mean that in the best way, because it's hysterical to end up in an extremely tangled situation where you agree to help out one of your partners, only to realize it harms your other nation's partner, and now you've holistically actually made no forward progress because one nation benefits, but then your other one falls behind because that partner's plans for it fell through. But yeah, that level of interconnectivity is hard to fully wrap your head around. Like, it is incredibly easy to end up in situations where you end up attacking yourself, sometimes on purpose, and sometimes due to one of your partners, since reminder that you can't stop them from doing whatever the hell they want with the nation you both control, besides blocking action spaces. But even that's temporary, because you gotta move those action pawns to do stuff. Anyways, imagine in the prior circumstance I brought up of helping one partner hurting another, you plan with one nation's partner to attack one spot, but then your other nation's partner ends up attacking that spot anyways, which from their standing is probably more beneficial than yours, where you functionally just attacked yourself. I say probably more beneficial in air quotes because, again, everything in this game is so relative to each other, because like attacking yourself could even be a good thing if you bring your 2 major nations' power to parity, because raising your lower nation's power is still getting you more points, which is also a really cool way to prevent just stacking up a million dudes and deathball conquering for one major nation, because that's a very common problem found in low randomness area control games if you want to guarantee wins. Here though, since everyone's standings are so inextricably tied to each other and ripple affecting constantly, there's straight up no point in fully investing in one major nation and rampaging if your other major nation is dog water. That and doing a coup to swap becomes diabolical in that situation. Games that make you use the lowest of a thing to score already do this well, but to further that mechanic by also having players share everything takes us to a whole new level. It's impossible to isolate yourself jorking it in your own corner farming points, so you have to get in there and cause a stir to get anywhere. If you can find a selfish action that somehow only benefits you without falling too far behind on that all-important board presence, since most of your points come from the major nation's power, it's hard not to take and should probably be prioritized. Ain't no action as selfish as repolarize, cause it's adjusting your secret objectives mid-game. And a very clever design too, cause that's not something you can repeatedly do to get more points. Which brings me to the asymmetry that gets further expanded upon in advanced mode. Cause look, we got abilities that only give yourself Virya on top of buffing existing actions. These all give really interesting play patterns to think about on top of painting targets in hyper-specialized ways. So like as an example, compare the Lizard King to the Clerical Espionage, which are both different ways of buffing their agents while still having the table think of them as the guys who will probably be interacting more often with coups. Lizard King has the biggest agent in the game. Clerical Espionage vastly improves the economy of spawning agents, and gives you info on objectives so you can make informed decisions when it comes to tipping the scales on who your actions should inadvertently help. Already you have to play around these effects in different ways because it's burst versus sustain. Now combine that with existing asymmetry, like how this major nation lets you preserve agents instead of getting rid of them after a coup, and suddenly you got a nasty combo that's hard to dismantle yet still balanced. Cause there's always the military option, which does its attacking and moving in the same action while agents still have to take an action to move and another to coup. But yeah, point is the asymmetry is already pretty good with just the major nations and provides more than enough considerations when drafting your picks at GameStar and subsequent counterplay plus potential ownership swaps. You throw on the advanced rules with player asymmetries on top of the new secret objectives for the major nations and not the players. Oh, and special action tiles? Oh my god, there's so many interesting interactions to get blindsided with, cause it's wild to see people contesting the Lizard King by using the Black Knight, doubling agents, and suddenly the whole table dynamic is upended. Can't do the opposite of doing Lizard King Black Knight though, cause it says Lizard King only works off the coup action of your pad, not the special tile. In fact, pretty much every major nation and secret society special effect has that stipulation to prevent the utmost busted of combos. That's what I like to see. Look at this balance-minded rules specification. Very thoughtful, very demure. It'd be backbreaking if you could combo two different special text actions like that. Cause already, special tiles are a way to cheat out tempo because the ones that are essentially a buffed version of an existing action in practice allow you to take that action for a major nation back to back, since these are two different spaces, so you're not blocking out the option with only one action pawn. So yeah, special actions, major nations, secret societies, boom, asymmetry, put them all together, and you get delightfully chaotic cowabungas. Speaking of chaos, I really want to highlight the genius nature of the way the secret objectives and 3-game endings are implemented here. Like already, the board state is unbelievably ephemeral, and you never fully feel invested in anything, so nonsense is constantly happening everywhere to everyone with all the self-attacking and coup-swapping shenanigans. So now you're telling me the game can end in one of 3 different ways, and different people are working towards them, and you can change your objectives mid-game? Truly, this game is allergic to commitment. Do not bring this energy into real life and ruin your marriages that are already on thin ice from your hundreds of unplayed board games cluttering up the house. Objectives provide such an interesting dynamic to your negotiations, cause like, if it turns out your partners want to destroy the world while you're out here finna light up 7 temples, you'll all be butting heads. In fact, they are greatly incentivized to attack your temples of light, cause remember, breaking buildings moves doom and stalls your win con. Okay, so then ideally you sniff out who's got matching objectives and partner with them so that you're on the same page with your game plan. Well, that still has its own problems, cause ultimately they are still your opponents and there's only one player who wins. So if they're in a better spot to win, it's a lot more restrictive the ways you can hurt them without hurting yourself because of the shared objectives. And all of the objectives have really interesting play patterns that, well, play into this game system so well. Like, something interesting that happens with doom-pilled players is that other players might start constructing less as counterplay, or make sure to heavily solidify their defenses and leave nothing vulnerable. Well, now this puts Doom Guy in an interesting spot because they can choose to Deathball, which is a slower way to blow up buildings because you commit a bunch of dudes and then go for only one space at a time if they still want to be actually attacking opponents. Or they can shrug, go wide, just plop random buildings down everywhere, super vulnerable, and just invite others to attack them, because if you don't, that's a lot of power from the land grab, but attacking also means you have to destroy a building if you win. Hell, I've even seen doom-chasing players cannibalize themselves thirsting after moving the tracker down. Just overall, the goofiest play patterns and most hysterical table talk. On the flip side, with trying to get a bunch of temples of light, the balancing decision of locking 4 of the 9 is brilliant, so you can't just bum rush the game end constructing a bunch early on. Also, why are there 9 instead of 7? Well, Now, if you go out of your way to move onto those wilderness spaces that start with the white cubes on them, you'll unlock more than you need to give you buffer room, because the game only checks if it ends every round instead of instantly. So those 7 buildings have to survive the whole round, but that's a lot easier to achieve if there's 9 buildings out and players have to destroy 3 of them to prevent game end instead of just 1 if there's 7. Very well thought out, telegraphed inevitability, because it takes a while to unlock everything, not just from moving around to significantly less useful spots since wilderness don't get building slots, but you also have to wait for game elements on the round track to reach deep into the game length. Also, the light temples themselves have a very greedy effect of providing 2 power to its major nation, but only at game end, meaning they are actually useless during the game. Thus, you're incentivized to only have as few out as possible, and then when you actually want to end the game, then you actually build a bunch all at once. Because the last thing you want is to sit on a bunch of useless buildings for too long when they could have upped your econ significantly. But you know what else that dynamic does? Remember how earlier I talked about being careful with partners even if they share an objective with you? Well, unlike with darkness and attacking each other more directly, with the light temples, the situation you're trying to avoid is doing the work to move units around into spaces to get those white cubes to unlock the temples of light, only for your partner to then build on their stuff for a huge power swing that doesn't actually benefit you. The nature of only being able to do one action a turn really makes it so that the reality of light temples being you gotta build more earlier on, even if it would be so much better to do it all on the last turn, just because it's so much harder to set that up. But yeah, now just imagine thinking through all that, working through the play patterns of these objectives, and then you repolarize to change out the objectives. Absolute cinema, peak gaming. Switch from Ascension to Doom. Start attacking your partner's light temples that you don't own. We unloyal as fuck. Oh, but also there's a balancing factor to that, because, and this is very big brain design, the cost to repolarize is Viria equal to the round number, meaning you can't just wait till the last moment and switch at the best moment unless you pay a huge cost. Unless you're doing advanced rules, playing as Order of Thoth, because it's free for them, and they get 3 cards instead of 2. Wow, what a crazy ability. Reminder that because Viria does get you some points, you may not even be going points positive if you pay the cost up front late game. So a more reasonable time would be doing this mid game and making a call that what you're switching to is how the game is going to end, which you'd think would be a self-fulfilling prophecy because with your additional help that objective is getting done faster. However, ain't nothing stopping someone else from also making a play to switch if they think they can put themselves in a situation to win an objective that has less people on it. God, I can't get over how well Era of Atlantis does its incentives to constantly keep people on their toes, because like the fact objectives gives less points the more people win them essentially makes them worthless if everyone bandwagons, because again, points are so relative since your actions constantly help other people. If you can be the guy that repolarizes into an objective type that no one else is going for and then cause that one's game end, that's a huge deal for getting a leg up on the competition. I'm just so impressed by all the ways to pivot, maneuver, and talk through all the mechanics at play. You never feel secure, and victories can still feel unexpected despite how this game essentially has no randomness aside from the initial setup. Normally in a little to no randomness experience, especially if it's just input randomness, those games can easily run into the issue of going through the motions in the last few turns, because it's quite clear who's going to win if you're planning out everyone's turns. Here though, because there's just the right amount of hidden information, plus the fact that everyone's incentives are so entangled, it means that it's pretty goddamn impossible to know what people are up to, because there are so many angles to progress any given game plan. Just the inclusion of military conflict versus political conflict alone does such a good job at providing different power lanes to contest areas over. You ultimately can't lock anything down unless you want to sacrifice power to do so, because an area entrenched with a ton of buildings and forces dedicated to conflict won't have buildings that actually raise power to win the game with. And even then, no matter how stacked a place is, it's basically impossible to fully insulate against both military and political conflict, especially when you take into account special effects that exist. Not to mention that I haven't really talked about bidding to influence conflict values, because reminder that everyone who's involved can get in the bid. And you want to know an easy way to get involved? Just airdrop agents to a place, since they don't adhere to movement restrictions. Everyone typically has some level of softer, looming global threat besides the typical global conflict action. Because just by parking some number of agents around, they can threaten coups on top of just using them to power up their favored sides in military conflicts. Again, another way to pivot and option select how you'd like to attack, and overall making it much harder to plan out precisely what people are going to do despite combat having no randomness. I could keep dropping examples, but overall the point is this game is a clusterfuck of overlapping incentives and mechanics in the best way because of how everyone is essentially proxy warring two nations instead of embodying them. So that's the key takeaway of the pros. Whew. enough of all that glazing, we gotta move on to component cons, and a reminder that this is all muddled because prototype, so not gonna go too hard on anything that's obviously just jank because of that. Anyway, seeing as I can't talk about build quality, let's instead talk about general readability concerns. Earlier in the pros, I talked about how Era of Atlantis nails representing the big picture stuff like points and power tracks. However, a bunch of other random implementations are kinda jank, especially because this game's systems are so tangled and bizarre that I can't even think of good solutions and easily see why they end up currently being jank in execution. The player boards do their jobs well enough, wouldn't call them super pretty or anything, and I'd be shocked if they weren't readable considering it's just actions in the Viria track. The con comes from this extended Viria track, aka compensation tile, being confusing and not slotting in well on the board with its weird shape. Basically all this does is give you extra Viria at the end of the game, which could result in more bonus points if you go past the usual cap. Compensation tiles are given out starting from first player and gets weaker going to second, third, etc. This is because going last in this game is a huge advantage, so earlier players have to be buffed somewhat to counteract the inevitable last turn player doing a mad power grab that no one gets to respond to at the very last turn. Anyways, I always have to hammer into newcomers that this tile only does something end of the game, and that I'm just giving it to them during setup so that they can look at it and plan out their Viria for endgame. Everyone thinks this extends their Viria track during the game, and why wouldn't you? It's just kind of what it looks like. The gameplay aspect of this feature is great, but the rulings and component part of it is jank and unintuitive. And I'm wondering if there's a better solution to balance out turn order that mechanically still works while still functioning and displaying well physically. Next up are all the colors, and this may sound weird coming from me, a guy who loves and advocates for color coding the crap out of everything, but this may actually be a case of too many colors. Color coding works at its best when you got like a handful of colors, but here you got 10, so there is some stark contrast lost. Specifically, I frequently see players mixing up gray and white along with red and orange, or even pink and red because the track looks a little more pink than red. I get that there has to be this many colors because of all the different factions at play here, but it would most definitely help to add even further distinction, like if all the secret societies had different agent art, or if all the major nations had different minis. Reminder that these meeples are a prototype and the plan is to have actual minis for the military units, but it looks like they're all going to be the same model, just different colors. But yeah, besides even more aesthetic distinctions, it would also help to make the track a deeper shade of red to better match the minis, and maybe don't use both gray and white, turn gray to brown or something. Would also help if the control marker cubes are also different from each other instead of being cubes, because if they were unique minis, it becomes quicker to glance over and see who actually owns what nations if you recognize a figure over purely just the color, since cubes are generic. All of this also doesn't even account for the building colors, because people also tend to glaze over spots and forget about stuff existing since they sometimes match the colors of the units. Again, because of how this game works with ownership swapping and whatnot, I'm really unsure of what would be an ideal solution to instantly convey ownership at a glance. Because this is still functional at the moment, but it does constantly add extra pauses of processing and darting your eyes around the table every time you need to plan. I'm also concerned about the readability of military size, because already there's tons of unit cramming going on in small nations. You'd think this gets alleviated thanks to these bigger pieces that represent 5 units, but that still doesn't fix the issue of not being able to quickly count up numbers if there's constant arms racing going on and people are spamming more and more units, which pretty much always happens every game once people start threatening global conflicts, so people are constantly having to keep up with each other's militaries. This does seem like it will be better in the final version, because apparently the board will be bigger, so that definitely helps, but still isn't a complete fix for, say, a blob of yellow that you gotta stop and count. No idea if the minis will help with that, or even introduce a new problem of taking up even more space because of their unique shapes versus being able to stack these meeples if you really need to. While that may be a preemptive concern, something that I assume will no doubt be an improvement from minis are the control markers, because right now these are just tiny discs and easy to miss because they have no verticality, and the final version plans to make little pawns for them. So overall, while the components are no doubt very functional and well put together for a prototype, there definitely still are possible improvements that could be made. If there are ways to design visual language to speed up mentally untangling the game state faster, I am all for it, because it's easy to accidentally mix up who owns what at what values and then have to restart your train of thought and reorientate your plans. Again, not saying it's dysfunctional or bad because all the info is here, it's just that because of how Era of Atlantis is designed, it seems like these issues are innate unless someone can come up with a design that can clearly depict the interconnectedness. Because yeah, come on, we really shouldn't have a white faction and white cubes that exist both as that faction stuff as well as the unlock trackers for the white temples of light. Even if those components are stuck in their own respective slots and will never get mixed up, it's still visual noise that blends super easily. But that's like only an organizational concern if you're a newcomer and all the game pieces get jumbled up somehow. Speaking of organization, no idea what the insert will look like since this is all just plastic bags thrown into a box, but I do have some trepidation about the insert easily being mid if it isn't given diligence, because that's a very easy area to flounder on for so many board games. I can see this game very easily falling into that category of niche, smaller audience. You know, folks more okay with things being obtuse, and so a lot of the nice-to-have aspects aren't valued as much because that target audience would just put up with it if their primary focus is just crazy gameplay mechanics. And with said crazy gameplay mechanics comes the gameplay cons, which are all basically going to be talking about some of the numbers feeling weird. Nebulous statement, I know. So, first point is how there's a component limitation cap for units. But the value is high enough, 30, that you can very easily have combats where bidding doesn't make a difference since it can only get 5 extra attack/defense. That, when combined with how bidding the highest 5 value costs 15 Virya, makes doing so extremely inefficient and only something that happens in emergencies since you lose so many points when losing 15 Virya. But then, if a conflict is that big of a deal, usually something like a global conflict, the attacker will probably already have done the numbers to ensure that they have enough of a majority to guarantee the win. Or the fight isn't worth losing 15 Virya over for their target, making the bidding process kind of a moot consideration. Thus, what ends up happening in practice is just an arms race where it's much more pressing to make sure you got a ton of military spawned everywhere to get not only way more bang for your buck in action economy, but also board presence. As a result, it can feel like the component limit becomes something like a checklist you have to reach, and less of a thoughtful limit to consider planning around. That also causes a secret component con in the gameplay section where the big dudes have a value of 5, so if all your units are already on the board and you want to split up a 5, it can get annoying figuring out how to rearrange your units to make it work. So the line of thought I got is if the component limit is high enough to make a lot of opportunistic fights functionally ignore bidding, I guess I'm wondering why not either lower the component limit so bidding can actually swing fights more and balance location defense values around that, or just get rid of it altogether and have ×5 tokens you can slip under units instead of the big dudes hogging space. Though if going that route, it should probably make bidding cheaper and or more impactful with bigger values alongside general number shifts across the board to account for that. That unit component limit, however, is one aspect of a bigger overarching problem of eventual stalemating going on where sweeping area changes don't really happen. Because once all the initial expanding happens and the dust is settled, it gets pretty hard to attack things without throwing a lot of your weight into it. But then at that point, it's way juicier to look for global conflicts on vulnerable targets instead of meticulously divvying up units and moving them around, since global conflict counts total units for the participating nations regardless of where those units are. Expanding too much means dividing units, making them more vulnerable to attacks, and it probably means you have more power from controlling more spaces. Therefore, all it takes really is someone finding a way to kill off some of them to tip the scales. And suddenly, your total unit count is less than the person who stockpiled like 20-something dudes all on like only 1 or 2 neighboring nations who can then global conflict your ass, but then they count as the power underdog and get the huge loot bonus. Like, unless you really need some specific plots of land for some reason, if you're just trying to get power up, getting a high unit count and bullying people who are not also spawn spamming is just so much value if you win. And even if they see you doing this and actually get the military to match, well, now you'll have a ton of guys and are probably going to allocate them to shore up defenses for a couple of immediate neighboring nations that are likely going to be super hard to attack. Plus, this can still threaten to do some slow and steady conquering somewhere, because if someone else gets slightly weaker for any reason, like moving out or losing some skirmish, again, because of the no randomness 5-bid max, it's a pretty low threshold to be able to guarantee punish that. Era of Atlantis is ultimately a more defensively rewarding game. So that, when combined with how this isn't really a game you're supposed to deathball a huge group around the map since you want to leave some defense on places you own, plus how it's super damaging to lose a big group like that to a coup, means that with doing only one action a turn, you can see why the game sort of defaults into that stalemate pace where people have tons of dudes shuffling around only to occasionally trade territories once anyone spots a window for a free win that can't be bid against. Like, if people are at parity, it usually means being attacked becomes a non-issue without outside intervention of multiple bidders, because only defenders get to make use of innate combat stats tied to an area. You attack a place that already has some of this brown number, and that's already uphill. If they decide to build a barracks building, which increases it by 5 while also enabling bigger spawn counts, that place in practice ends up never getting attacked militarily, so coups become the go-to. So yeah, even though in the pros I brought up how the incentives for winning don't encourage rolling around the good old death ball of units, you ultimately still bunch up to win fights. Which is why I described earlier this pseudo stalemate of trading around territory, because yeah, that can easily happen if you gotta pull a dude somewhere and leave a vacated spot undefended to get snap snatched up. Like, the only time you actually get away with doing a crazy play of grabbing a bunch of spaces all at once is if it's the last turn and places got weakened because people were already fighting, so then you get to swoop in for cheap unit investment knowing that no one will get to go after you to punish this. And because of how slow and committal actions are, since you only do one a turn and block it off for a minimum a whole round, it's really hard to get back in the fray quickly. That whole dynamic plays another big role in why it's so hard to definitively pull ahead of people in points. And because of how long it takes to set up your maneuvering, this all makes it so that objectives are oftentimes not really in your control and can feel less important. Already people I've played with were kind of like, why do the objectives even matter? I only get 1 or 2 points off them. And while yes, that actually is a big deal because of how hard it is to pull ahead, it is something that's again not super in your control. So if you're banking on achieving a certain game end first and foremost over the bread and butter like getting your Virya and power up, it's not gonna work out. Unless you somehow are the only one with the right objective at game end and you have a full hand of it, which I've never seen, right? Because like for that to happen, that means everyone else holds different objectives, meaning they're playing towards them while you are the only player going towards yours and somehow succeeding at ending the game that way. Like, is this so much safer to hold different objective cards so that you're super likely to get a bonus point while also weakening anyone who's trying to go all in on one ending since you're now another player diluting the objective point pool? But who knows, maybe all this is just a result of playing only at 4 and 5p, because I can see the lower player counts being maybe more fluid and able to grant each player more agency over the game state. See, this is where I gotta admit that these aren't necessarily definitive cons, more just strange feeling play patterns we see popping up that can definitely be played around once you know what's up, because at the end of the day, the core gameplay loops are all still super engaging to interact with. The stalemating does make it so that every actual victory feels way more meaningful. It's just that it's very common for people to not know what to do once the board is more developed, because it's hard to recognize where to begin even getting points since everything is so interconnected. Along with how it's not the most obvious that even 1 point swings make a huge difference, since if you look at the power track, you think, those numbers are like in the dozens, so 1 doesn't feel like a lot. But remember that a lot of that power is kind of a given and you're sharing it, so to see who's actually winning, you gotta see who gets the most out of those little bonus point gains, like a Virya, given that it's easy for everyone's weaker major nation to all be around the same power ballpark. Thus, a more concrete con would be pacing and game length, because with everything that was just described, those gameplay patterns make a lot more sense for a longer game experience, where slower, gradual progress gets a chance to actually develop far. But here, games can take like 2 hours and feasibly end once everyone's taken like 10 turns. Very much a time frame that's much more conducive to a game with much higher, what's the word? I guess liquidity with your actions. What I mean by that is if you think about a game like Root, which occupies a similar, usually even shorter time frame, while Root does have plenty of restrictions on how you can move, the actual game state is incredibly explosive because it's possible for a single turn to involve huge amounts of movement and attacks with much less punishment for doing so. AKA, more stuff gets to happen, which is very fitting for the time frame. It's way more likely with Era of Atlantis to evoke the feeling of either not getting to do the stuff you wanted to do, or for the game to feel like it just kind of ends. And not like a sudden, whoa, what the game just ended, because obviously it's super telegraphed. It's more like a feeling of just kind of ends, and you're like, that's it. Which obviously brings up the age-old debate of whether or not you should be able to do all the things in a game before it ends, to which I'd answer with, it depends on what the game is trying to do, and I'd argue here the length and action restrictions would work better if there were even more effective / faster ways to be disruptive, because coups aren't as fast as military conflict, and aren't even guaranteed unless you're the Lizard King. There's just too much riding upon early actions to build up your foundations, where if someone falls behind on setting up the initial land grab turns, it makes that major nation have much less action efficiency when it comes to doing things like collecting Virya, spawning units, etc. That'd be fine if there were more ways to create openings to take advantage of, or if the game went long enough for the big fish to blow each other out of the water. But at the moment, it's encouraging people to get their bag and play risk averse, aka defensive, aka not enough control changing actually happening, but a lot of it's sure being threatened. Alright, scoring time, but real quick, it'd be cool if you could drop a like on the video. And if you want to further support us, we got a Patreon and a coffee, links are right there and in the description. Thank you all so much for the patronage. For Era of Atlantis' a recommender score, but actually tentative score because it's a prototype, we rate the game based on how well we think the game is doing what it's trying to do. In this case, a 2-hour area control game where players share control over 2 major nations to act out the craziness of secret societies controlling the world behind the scenes. It's getting an 8 out of 10. a great game. For a prototype, this one is really fleshed out. Like, it feels about 90% of the way there to the full release. Makes it a lot easier to talk about. The core mechanics seem pretty set in stone. Like, I can't imagine the trademark multi-nation control mechanics being taken out. And those mechanics are so good for doing the whole secret society vibe. That dynamic and how it colors the player's interactions is the heart and soul of Era of Atlantis. And because this score is framed around it is why it gets docked a bit for the stagnating defensive play that's incentivized, since it can feel a little antithetical to pushing players to do stuff and cause hilarious drama between each other. Made even more noticeable by the shorter game length for this genre. Also, just by nature of what the game is, the blurrier sense of understanding what to do and mechanics being a little obtuse due to the multi-control seems like an inherent problem that I don't think can be cleanly solved, and so has to be something your group is okay with. And to be clear, it isn't obtuse in that endless canvas way where there's seemingly limitless gameplay expression which can be overwhelming. More than that, there's definitely some things that must/should be done, and it might not be obvious to do them while still not being immediately discernible even when known. A huge part of that is the combination of set in stone values, aka no RNG, plus the existence of super strong abilities like the special actions to bypass restrictions, all being obfuscated by the multiple controllers thing. Like, not only do you have to recognize something strong, you also got to see who owns it and then think about those two players' other two nations and how it ripple affects their capabilities too. Very much not straightforward. Really gotta be royally screwed over by a global conflict, some special nonsense, or even cringe at your troop placement not being able to deterministically win key fights and or cross key paths via grouping to get those lessons hammered in. So yeah, definitely a more niche title for people who love weirder mechanics and less amenities. The rulebook is currently, for the most part, a wall of text with the occasional image. All formatted less dynamically, so it doesn't fit the needs of particular imagery and instead into strict columns. That presentation alone can already be a pretty good indicator for the type of player Era of Atlantis should draw. Thus, with all that in mind, is why the 2 points are docked, leading to the 8 out of 10 great score as a prototype. Hopefully further changes like some of the aforementioned component suggestions in the review can be implemented, so that when combined along with improvements we know are coming, like the bigger board, will make the potential final product score go up. Finally, there's one more thing that I'd be remiss not to address, and that's the source material Era of Atlantis draws its theme from, which is the ancient aliens, chariot of the gods type stuff about aliens taking the credit for ancient human accomplishments. That is quite understandably a massive red flag. There's notably racism in those circles, usually stemming from things like ethnocentrism and dishonest omissions of blatant inequalities. Whether that be assuming incapabilities from savage lesser peoples, therefore aliens must have intervened, to early explorers post-justifying manifest destiny to waltz over supposedly undeveloped lands, these are ways to willfully ignore past people's accomplishments to twist a narrative to fit. Thankfully, CJ Games' website has a disclaimer about them that addresses this, which is definitely a good thing to lay out. However, still doesn't do enough to admonish the source material for perpetuating actually harmful racist adjacent beliefs, and it's kind of telling that there'd even need to be a disclaimer like this in the first place. And just to be clear, here at Shelfside, we do not hold the beliefs found in these sources. I think just knowing that stuff like the Black Israelites and Chinese Western pseudo-histories exist makes me compare all this and see how easy it is to do post hoc justification from jank correlations drawn, which can very easily be from hard-to-notice subconsciously internalized racist beliefs. Like, imagine a Chinese dude who's super nationalistic and buys into all the America bad attitudes. That's a pretty good framework for the subconscious biases that primes someone towards believing Western pseudo-history theory, where they think a large number of Greek and Roman accomplishments are fabricated. Apparently, the stupid Westerners couldn't possibly have had the tools needed back then to make detailed sculptures, and this is all fabricated because it's actually built in the last few hundred years instead of thousands in order to fake being really ancient and technologically advanced so they can pretend to be just as cool and ancient as China in order to promote Western superiority. I honestly find it kind of adorable you can just find these types of beliefs everywhere, because it's giving children boasting about their incredulous achievements and makes me more reassured that we're all just silly humans all over the world, no matter where you're from. Also, it's really funny doing this review coming from the Primal review I did earlier this year, where I bring up an archaeologist's BGG review of that game, somewhat going down a rabbit hole of reading about racism and archaeology and disappearing society tropes, and then boom, that info quickly became relevant again because of this video. So yeah, might not have done this review if it was an uninteractive medium like a movie, but because there's actually a sick game here, it's still worth talking about. Plus, it's assuring to see their credited writer with this super based banner in their LinkedIn. But if these sources completely turn you away from Era of Atlantis, that is a perfectly valid response. With all that in mind, the long and short of it is, if you're looking for a low to no randomness area control game for your group that's 2 hours long and has a super unique premise with a double sharing nation action controlling with highly involved table talk and blind bidding combat, this is definitely a solid game found pickup. As for my personal enjoyment of Era of Atlantis, funny enough, it's exactly the same at an 8 out of 10 great time. For the score to rise for me, first, it would definitely help if this wasn't a prototype, because I am a huge enjoyer of very nice components. Next, it's much harder for things to get 9s and 10s for me without tons of art everywhere, with super compelling aesthetics and probably some minis. Because yeah, the vibes and visuals don't exactly grab me here. What does really grab at me though is the gameplay, for how ridiculously novel it is. Like, despite the oddly slow pace of the game, even though it runs quick, there's just surprisingly so much happening as potential options that you can frame the game state in a bajillion ways when negotiating with other players. Do I wish this was longer so that mechanical depth gets more of an opportunity to shine? Sure, but while I do appreciate good, crunchy gameplay, I think the more important thing is to combine that with amazing table talk. And by God, does Era of Atlantis facilitate that. I still can't get over the ridiculous situations that occur, like attacking yourself, and just giving leader games level of stupid shit happening that's too irresistibly funny to not do. That's fully up my alley. It's guaranteed to lead to the funniest table banter, which is definitely my favorite aspect of board gaming with good friends. Which is also why I wish there could be some sort of ingenious solution to perfectly, cleanly convey the tangle of information on the board at a glance to make it easier on my friends so we can get to the good part faster. Then for my mechanical preferences, very much checks off the feeling that I can do all sorts of things on any given turn with all the options. But as for the randomness level, a little too low for me, because yeah, there's none of it here besides the initial draws and setup. My style is low randomness, like when you're rolling a 4-sided die with low range of potential outcome during combat. Thankfully, the combat still provides ample tension without RNG, because it's not only blind bidding, but also potentially got multiple participants. To me, it's almost all the way there with what type of uncertainty I like, since the vast majority of how you navigate through this game is via making agreements with people about who's getting involved where and to what degree. And you need to do this. I love how this restriction is built into the action system, where you really have to coordinate with your partners to free up certain action spaces, or even set up something like someone first recruits and then the next person attacks. It's just a super funny way of keeping players engaged, because you can never keep bigger tactics to yourself and have to, say them aloud if you want to sequence your actions properly and not trip over each other. Which also leads to the whole table hearing these plans, since you're not allowed to secretly communicate, and as a result, you are constantly tuned into the non-stop shenanigans and mishaps of the whole table. So yeah, Era of Atlantis really sets itself apart in my headspace compared to every other area control I've played. Like, I cannot stress enough just how novel of an experience this is, and always look forward to how the next game will play out thanks to the variety of permutations and random setup factors, plus how people go about their objectives. It really does make me feel like I'm partaking in some crazy tangled mess that only continues to get messed up as the game goes on, and really has our friends constantly joking about conspiratorial hilarity all the while. Thanks for watching all the way till the end. See you all in the next video.